In a world on the brink of chaos, with empires expanding and tensions rising, a sudden and unexpected attack shifts the course of history. For Japan, it was a calculated strategic move. For the United States, a devastating surprise. This raises the question, why did Japan undertake such a bold assault? Let's explore the complex events that led to the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor. Before we dive into the specifics of December 7, 1941, we need to understand the bigger picture, Japan, a nation with ambitions that stretch beyond its shores, and the United States, a superpower keen on maintaining its influence in the Pacific. In the early 20th century, Japan was transforming from a traditionally isolated society into a modern imperial power. They were growing rapidly, both economically and militarily, and as their power grew, so did their hunger for resources. Japan is a country rich in culture, but poor in natural resources. With limited access to vital materials like oil, steel, and rubber, the expansion into neighboring territories became a necessity to sustain their rapid industrialization. This desire led to increased military activity in places like Korea, China, and Southeast Asia, regions brimming with the raw materials Japan desperately needed. Now, enter the United States. A nation with significant interests in the Pacific and Asia, America was watching Japan's expansion with growing unease. Especially concerning was Japan's war with China, which had been raging since 1937. The atrocities committed by Japanese forces during the conflict, including the horrific Nanking Massacre, further strained relations between the two countries. America responded with sanctions, cutting off Japan's access to vital resources, notably oil, which was essential to the Japanese war machine. The tension was palpable. Japan felt cornered. Without oil, their dreams of expansion would be crushed. They had two choices: submit to American demands or fight for their survival. The economic sanctions imposed by the United States in 1940 and 1941 were a crucial factor in Japan's decision to strike. These sanctions weren't just a slap on the wrist, they were a death sentence for Japan's ambitions. The country was dependent on imports to sustain its military. The U.S. embargo on oil was particularly crippling. As negotiations dragged on, both sides reached an impasse. Japan, led by Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and Emperor Hirohito, believed they had no choice but to prepare for war. Diplomacy wasn't working. The Americans were demanding that Japan withdraw from China, which was an unacceptable condition for Japan. Withdrawal meant humiliation, and Japan wasn't willing to back down. In October 1941, after months of failed negotiations, Tojo became the new prime minister, signaling a more aggressive stance. The war hawks in the Japanese government, including military leaders like Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, were already devising a plan for a bold, risky strike that could neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet and give Japan the upper hand. But even within Japan's leadership, there was doubt. Yamamoto himself was skeptical of Japan's chances in a prolonged war with the United States. But he was tasked with devising the plan anyway. The strategy? Attack Pearl Harbor, cripple the U.S. Navy, and force America into peace negotiations, allowing Japan to consolidate its gains in Asia. By late 1941, Japan's leaders were convinced that war was inevitable. The only question was how to fight it. They saw two potential paths: wait for the U.S. to take the first step, which would be disastrous for Japan, or strike first and hope for a swift victory. Yamamoto's plan was audacious: a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy's primary base in the Pacific. If they could destroy the American fleet, Japan could secure dominance over the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Americans, caught off guard, would have no choice but to negotiate on Japan's terms, or so they thought. Japan had a clear timeline: They knew that their oil reserves would last only a couple of years, meaning they had a short window to achieve a decisive victory before their economy and military ground to a halt. The Pearl Harbor attack wasn't just a bold military maneuver, it was a desperate gamble. On November 26, 1941, a Japanese strike force consisting of 6 aircraft carriers, battleships, and support vessels set sail for Pearl Harbor under the strictest secrecy. Their mission is to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Yamamoto and his team hoped that this crippling blow would give Japan the time and space to conquer Southeast Asia and secure the resources they needed to survive. On December 7, 1941, the morning at Pearl Harbor began like any other for the U.S. military personnel stationed there. However, at 7:48 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack. Nearly 353 Japanese bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters descended upon the harbor, catching the Americans completely off guard. The attack targeted Battleship Row, where 8 U.S. battleships were moored. The USS Oklahoma was struck early and capsized, trapping hundreds of sailors. The USS Arizona suffered the most devastating blow when a massive bomb detonated its ammunition stores, killing 1,177 crew members in a fiery explosion. Fires from Arizona's explosion burned for 2 days, leaving the ship as a sunken memorial. Japanese planes also targeted airfields, including Hickam Field and Wheeler Army Airfield, destroying nearly 200 American aircraft on the ground. Despite the widespread destruction, acts of bravery emerged. One notable example was Dory Miller, an African-American cook aboard the USS West Virginia, who heroically manned an anti-aircraft gun despite having no formal training. The attack unfolded in 2 waves, with the first wave focusing on ships and aircraft, and the second targeting airfields and military infrastructure. Despite crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the Japanese failed to hit key targets, such as fuel depots, repair facilities, and the U.S. aircraft carriers, which were out on maneuvers. In just 90 minutes, the attack killed 2,403 Americans and wounded 1,178 more. It also resulted in the loss of 19 ships and nearly 200 aircraft. Though it was a tactical success for Japan, the attack ultimately unified and enraged the American public, leading the U.S. to enter World War II the next day. This miscalculation by Japan would set the stage for their eventual defeat. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan failed to achieve its long-term goals. While they inflicted heavy damage on the U.S. Pacific Fleet, key military infrastructure like fuel depots and repair yards remained intact. Crucially, the U.S. aircraft carriers, central to future naval battles, were not at the harbor and thus escaped the attack. In the hours following the assault, the U.S. launched immediate rescue efforts for trapped sailors in damaged ships like the USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma. The attack shocked the nation, uniting the American public in anger and a desire for retribution. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his famous speech, calling the attack a date that will live in infamy. That same day, Congress declared war on Japan with overwhelming support, pulling the United States into World War II. This marked a pivotal shift, as the U.S. quickly mobilized its vast industrial power for war, converting factories to produce military equipment on an unprecedented scale. Despite Japan's early successes, their strategy miscalculated the resilience of the U.S. The Pacific Fleet recovered quickly, and within months, damaged ships were repaired and returned to action. The U.S. was soon able to challenge Japan in key battles like the Battle of Midway, turning the tide of the war. Japan's miscalculation didn't end there. Germany and Italy, Japan's Axis allies, declared war on the U.S. shortly after, pulling America into a global conflict on 2 fronts. This, combined with the vast American industrial mobilization, spelled Japan's eventual defeat, culminating in their surrender in 1945 after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 was a significant strategic error. While it caused initial damage to the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Japan underestimated the resilience and industrial capacity of the United States. The attack united the American public, transforming isolationist sentiments into overwhelming support for entering World War II. Japan hoped for a quick victory that would force peace negotiations, but instead, it ignited a prolonged conflict. The U.S. rapidly mobilized its industrial resources, allowing for a swift recovery of its military power. Key battles, such as the Battle of Midway, shifted the balance in favor of the U.S., leading to Japan's gradual defeat. By 1945, Japan faced dire circumstances, with its cities devastated and its military weakened. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, alongside the Soviet declaration of war, compelled Japan to surrender unconditionally. The attack that aimed to assert Japanese dominance ultimately led to its downfall and established the United States as a global superpower. In the end, Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor was driven by a complex web of economic desperation, military ambition, and strategic miscalculations. The attack may have been a temporary victory, but it ultimately set Japan on a path to defeat. The gamble didn't pay off, and what was intended as a blow for dominance became a trigger for one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. If there's one thing the Pearl Harbor attack teaches us, it's the unpredictable nature of war. Decisions made in the heat of the moment can have consequences that ripple across the decades. The world we live in today is still shaped by those events, a reminder of how quickly peace can turn into war. Thanks for watching. If you found this breakdown of the Pearl Harbor attack insightful, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most pivotal moments. Share your thoughts on how you think history would have unfolded had Japan chosen a different path. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments below.